Good evening, everyone. Just want to welcome you to this evening for tonight's webinar, Creating Equitable Discipline Outcomes for Managing the Risk Factors for Implicit Bias. My name is Dewana Nicole, and I am representing the Restorative Justice Partnership, a collaboration of Denver Public Schools, Denver Classroom Teachers Association, Padres y Jóvenes Unidos, National Education Association, an organization I work for, Advancement Project. Before we get started, as usual, I have a quote for this evening that I'm going to read. And this is from Robertson Davies, who says, "The eye sees only what the mind is prepared to comprehend." So when we talk about restorative justice implementation, one of the things we highlight is the need for complementary professional development offerings like anti-racism training, adultism, and then today's topic, implicit bias. We are joined this evening by Kristen Powell, who's a project coordinator at the Center for Policing Equity. Kristen just wrapped up a collaborative research project called the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice, which was initiated by the U.S. Department of Justice during the last administration. During this work, she partnered with police departments to pilot and study effective interventions for addressing bias and strengthening trust between the police and community. And that includes training, policy, and data collection and analyses. And those trainings and efforts are now going to be brought to departments nationally, and research and evaluations to show that these trainings and taking time to understand the role of implicit bias and interactions do actually have an impact on department perception and actual reductions in behavior. So as usual, the way this will work this evening is that we will go through the PowerPoint, and then we will take questions at the end. If you have a question, then you can type it in the question box, or you could, raise your hand, or if you are on your phone, because unfortunately, if you are just calling in on your phone, I am not able to unmute you to take your question, but you can always email me your question, and you should have my email address from the webinar, and then I will read your question to Kristen for an answer. This webinar is being recorded, and so with that, I will now hand it over to Kristen.
Thanks so much, Joanna. Hi, everybody. My name is Kristen Powell, and I'm here with the Center for Policing Equity. I also just want to thank you for taking the time today to participate in this webinar and learn more about implicit bias and how it plays out in situations. And today, that's what we're really talking about. What does implicit bias do, and how does it impact, these wider experiences that we refer to as the school to prison pipeline, and also thinking about what does it mean for you as an educator, and what can you do to address it on a day-to-day basis. Now, my understanding, and as Joanna said, it sounds like there's been a series of webinars, and a lot of this has focused on this restorative justice, which is fantastic. So I'd say, in case you're wondering how implicit bias fits into the grand scheme of things, implicit bias is essentially another tool to help you on a day-to-day basis to help manage risk factors that could contribute to any sort of disparity or inequitable outcome in discipline such situations for your students. And so the school to prison pipeline and disparities that come with it, obviously it's a really, really big issue. And so it requires a lot of wraparound tools and wraparound strategies to really try to address it. So one thing that's valuable about implicit bias is it's sort of a proactive step that you can take. Some proactive, the more you understand it, the more you engage with this idea and concept, the more that you're prepared when these situations come up. So you're not doing any sort of reconciliatory or follow-up work, but rather proactive work from the get-go. So we'll take about an hour to talk through these concepts. I have sort of three areas that we'll tackle, and then when it's over, again, we'll have time for about 30 minutes for questions. So feel free to submit these as we go, or submit them right at the end to wait to see if they're answered or not. But my intent today is to show you where implicit bias shows up, why it matters for you as an educator, and what the sort of cognitive breakdown of it is, and then leave you with some strategies to help you address this in your own life and in your own educational scenarios. Hold on, I'm clicking on the slides, trying to get them to move. There we go. So, like I said, I'm coming here from the Center for Policing Equity. We are a research and action think tank. Our big logo, our big tagline is that we do science to promote justice. So we have offices all over the country and are coming from all types of disciplines: psychology, sociology, law enforcement. And our intent is to partner with both law enforcement and school districts to really address areas of equity, try to identify where there are disparities, and then do work to really go at those. And so we do that through training, specifically implicit bias training. We also do that through data analysis and through policy implementation. So like Duana mentioned, I just wrapped up a project where our intent was to roll out implicit bias trainings and figure out, what does and doesn't work. And we did that with law enforcement and police community groups. And the intent is to really strengthen trust all across the board and really rebuild relationships. And then also try to figure out, how do we tackle implicit bias and talk about it in a way that actually impacts and changes behavior. One of the things that we found through research is by engaging in webinars like this and trainings like this, you can actually go pretty far in trying to make those changes that have long-standing impacts. Now, with this work, we have, let me see. So with this work, we're going to be talking specifically about the role of implicit bias and how it shows up for you. And the entire time thinking about, what are resources for equitable change and how does that apply in your day-to-day. So to start, I want to tell you a little story that my coworker Nikki recently shared with me. And she calls it the dress incident. So Nikki tells me that back when she was a student in high school, she was one day on her way to class and actually almost running a little bit late. And out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a male student walking into class 2 wearing a dress. Now, she didn't think anything of it, and she keeps heading to class, and then she hears behind her a student resource officer stopping the student and starting to hassle him or harass him a little bit. And she tries to intervene really quickly. Being the social justice advocate she is, she goes up and she tries to say, well, what's the issue? Why are you bugging him? He's just trying to go to class. And the school resource officers say, well, he's violating dress code. He can't be wearing a dress to school. And she argues, well, I wore a dress yesterday. And then she starts to really engage with the officers. She starts to try to pull other students into it. And it really creates a scene in the middle of the hallway. Now, another teacher steps in, comes up to her and says, Nikki, you need to go to class. The other students, you need to go to class. The school resource officer is going to sit here and deal with this student. So everybody kind of disperses and goes back to class, and that's the end of Nikki's story. Now, the teacher in this situation really could have perceived these infractions in all kinds of ways. But here they stepped in, they evaluated the situation, and they were like, sure, this student, Nikki, we know her. We know that she has a good heart and is just trying to advocate for what she believes is right. And she's going to go to class and it's not going to be an issue. But depending on the teacher and depending on their perception of the experience, they could also identify these as more serious infractions, maybe inciting a disturbance, defying authority, encouraging defiance of other students, ultimately disrupting the education atmosphere. Now, depending on the degree of how that's measured, there could be a reasonable punishment that's put with that could include more exclusionary practices like suspensions, expulsions, and depending on how quickly or to what degree it escalated, could end up in arrest for somebody. So while the student, Nikki in this case, who is still developing adolescent and is just trying to, test boundaries, trying to advocate for what she believes is right, she's not thinking very far into the future. The teacher still has a responsibility in that moment to consider what the impact is of their interpretation of the situation and has a lot of power on how they react to that situation. And what matters with that is not just that single moment, but what its long-standing impact is going to be on Nikki if she gets cited with one of these higher infractions like defying authority or disrupting the educational environment. And these referrals have a long-standing impact and can really start a chain reaction for students. So let's talk a little bit about this, right? So these exclusionary disciplines like suspensions, expulsions, and school-related arrests end up having these really long-standing impacts that nobody really would have thought in the moment. But research has found that students who are suspended end up being at a higher risk than their peers to end up in future disciplinary action, to have contact with the juvenile justice system in the future, and even to drop out, all because of single suspensions. And additionally, students who are arrested are less likely than their peers to complete high school or enroll in college. And this actually aligns pretty well with some of the research that we've been doing at the Center for Policing Equity. We have a juvenile injustice and education arm that studies specifically, what are the outcomes with disciplinary actions and how do they impact students. And in a recent partnership with a larger school district, they followed administrative records for a kindergarten cohort that graduated in about June of 2016. Now, when they essentially took all of these students and their demographics and the administrative data that was available, and they broke people up into different categories, looking at those who had been suspended or those who had violated certain offenses, and they divided the students into two groups. One of the groups was students who had been suspended, and one of the groups was for students who had committed the same offense who had not been suspended. And what they found is that the suspended students ended up having lower, middle, and high school GPAs, all because of these incidents that happened somewhere between kindergarten and fifth grade. And eventually, the research found that they were significantly less likely to graduate than students referred or not suspended, even though ultimately in kindergarten through fifth grade, they're engaging in the same sort of behavior. Sorry, my slides are a little slow. Now, Black students are disproportionately represented in these outcomes, and this is part of why we care, right? Aside from the fact that just these disciplinary outcomes have longstanding impacts on any sort of student, we're seeing a particularly large population of Black students relative to their non-white counterparts and their white counterparts when it comes to the actual risk of being expelled and the risk of facing multiple suspensions. Now, with data from the U.S. Department of Education, we see that that is 3 times as likely for suspension or 3 times as likely for expulsion and 4 times as likely for suspension. They're also 2 times as likely to receive referral to law enforcement or be subject to a school-related arrest as compared to white students. And I want to note here, too, that I recognize that there are a lot of disparities when it comes to actual school discipline, and it's not just Black students that are impacted. We see substantial disparities when it comes to Latino students and Native American students. But there's something really interesting, and just the numbers are essentially off the charts with Black students. And so today, as we're talking through this webinar and talking through these slides, I want to reiterate that one of the biggest issues that we have to face here is specifically the experience of discipline when it comes to Black students and how they're being perceived and responded to. So the question that comes up with us really quickly when we see these disparities is what's causing them, right? What we found, or what most research has found, is that it has very little to do with actual behavior. So studies have revealed that Black students don't have a higher rate of school misconduct. So we can't say that it's behavior. We're seeing that they're not committing more serious infractions than their white students. So we can't say that that's why they're getting harsher punishments. And other studies, they've controlled for the same things like demographics and school environments. Is it because of the socioeconomic status? Is it because of where the school is or how many students are enrolled in classes and what that impact is? And what we're finding is that it doesn't explain it, and nothing else is really accounting for what those racial disparities are. Now, studies have indicated that disparities in some circumstances might be caused by Black students being over-selected for punishment and or being punished more harshly for the same misbehaviors as their non-Black peers. And this is what we refer to as differential selection and differential processing. So differential selection is essentially when you identify one group of students to receive a punishment while other students who are engaging the same behavior get off scot-free. And differential processing is when, various students all across the board are getting in trouble for something, but certain groups of students, maybe specifically the Black students, are receiving substantially harsher punishments. And a good way to remember this is an example of, let's say there's a food fight in the classroom, or in the lunchroom. Differential selection means that even though 100 people in the lunchroom participated in the food fight, you identify 5 or 6 students and you say, I think you're the ones who started it. You have to go to the principal's office. And eventually maybe those students get suspended. Differential processing means that you acknowledge that 100 students participated in the food fight, but then you say, all of these students are going to get in trouble, but some of the students, they seem to throw the milk harder than the others. Some of the students, they still seem like when we told them to stop throwing food, they took longer to listen and respond. And so then they end up with a harsher punishment. So keep in mind this idea of differential selection, differential processing, because we'll come back to this a little bit. So one of the things that comes up is when we're trying to figure out, what makes us process students differently or identify different students as being culpable or in trouble for a behavior. A lot of it is about how we characterize and understand a student's behavior. Now, you all know as you work with students and that adolescents are constantly developing and engaging in pretty normal youth behavior, right? They're testing boundaries, they're taking risks, they're trying to figure out who they are. Like I said, Nikki, from my story earlier, she's engaging in trying to explore what it means to be an advocate for social justice issues, what it means to really care or be passionate or want to stand up for other people, and trying to figure out how to do that still within boundaries and limitations. They're also going to be likely to engage in different sorts of antisocial behavior that isn't a reflection maybe of how they truly feel, but it's just them sorting themselves out. Their brains are still under construction, and like Nikki and like other students, students aren't really able to think of the sort of long-term impacts that we would like. So part of the issue here that we face is that there is ambiguity in this sort of policy and identification of behaviors. So for example, if I am about to start English class and I come into the classroom and two of my students are starting to get in a tiff in the back of the room and they start pushing and shoving, maybe they're joking, maybe they're serious. I as a teacher can say, yep, that's pushing and shoving. Or I can say, no, stop, that's battery, and that's going to be a much harsher response and a harsher punishment that comes down the line later. Another example might be you have a couple girls in the back of the classroom who are trying to take each other's cell phones, and maybe they're joking, maybe they're trying to text somebody, who knows. You could call that just taking each other's cell phones or swiping a cell phone, or you could identify that as theft or robbery. A lot about which one you pick is dependent on how you in the moment are perceiving that situation. And if you see it as swiping a cell phone, obviously any sort of punishment or any sort of response really is going to be a lot lower and a lot less concern than it is to identify it as a theft or robbery. Another one is talking back. I'm sure you all as educators have experienced this quite often. You're going to have students who push back on the things you say, speak out of turn, and you can just consider this talking back and part of what comes with them learning and their adolescence and growing, or you can identify that as disorderly conduct. And when you turn to disorderly conduct, the likelihood that you're going to feel the need to refer them to another person or to give them, a heavier sentence is going to be more increased. And as you know, that can have a stronger impact on their futures. And so one of the things, let me speak to you real quick before we jump back or before we move forward to, is that one of the issues that you all will constantly run into, and I'm sure do now, is there are a lot of unclear policies and a lot of times when situations are ambiguous. And that's something that you'll have to continue to work with. Part of what you can do is make sure that for your students that you're really clear what the rules are from the get-go, right? So you make sure that students understand that if they talk back, this is what it means. And so that's a clear and communicated rule between you and them. It's also, I think, important for your school as a whole to make sure that there's clear policies on this so that you're not trying to figure out, okay, how many times do you have to push and shove before you consider it a fist fight or battery, right? Because that creates so much ambiguity that it's hard for you to make a clear decision when you're accounting for so many factors. So let's talk about what helps you make that clear decision in the moment, and also what it is that might be actually shooting you in the foot. So before we talk about implicit bias, there's a really important concept I want you all to understand, and that is the idea of implicit association. This essentially means that idea or concept number A is tightly linked to concept number B, and your brain does this in a sort of really automatic subconscious way. Now, your brain is constantly trying to help you, right? It's constantly absorbing different sorts of pieces of information, and it does this association effort in an attempt to be more efficient and make your day easier so that you don't have to constantly be pulling in every single detail, but instead your brain can sort of lean on things that are familiar, identify patterns, and draw those connections so that you're not exhausted by simple tasks. But here's the tricky part. When one concept is primed or made obvious, the other becomes a lot more accessible without conscious deliberation. And so one of the questions you have to ask is, where are these associations coming from? How does my brain decide that concept A is connected to concept B? And it organizes these kind of in puzzle pieces. So, for example, if I say peanut butter, you say jelly, right? If I say I'm going to make a peanut butter and blank sandwich, your first thought is going to probably be jelly. But when you say that, you're not taking time to think, okay, well, I've seen peanut butter and jelly together. Peanut butter probably means it's associated with food. She's probably talking about a sandwich. Let me put all that together and say jelly. Instead, your brain says, oh, yeah, I know the association between peanut butter and jelly. Those things tend to go together. Another example of this is if I say 4th of July, what images might be coming to your head? Perhaps fireworks, barbecues, experiences that you've had or that you've seen on TV about what 4th of July looks like. Perhaps ideas that are kind of larger, like independence, freedom, these other ideas, or perhaps just simple colors, red, white, blue. Now, whatever comes to mind is with the 4th of July. A lot of that is from your personal experiences, from simple things that you've absorbed. But now, just by a key phrase or a key holiday that I introduced to you, you have all of these other thoughts and concepts and ideas that are flooding in with it, and your brain is trying to take all that and make it easier for you to understand and interact with whatever comes next. So the question is, where does this come from, right? So some of these associations we make are explicit and conscious. You might remember those associations taught in maybe a DARE class that, drugs equal bad, or driver's ed, that, seatbelt is a good thing. And you remember these being really explicit, teachable moments that were conscious and intentional. And then other times there's these associations that are subconscious or implicit. So here I'm showing you a series of brands. There's no words on here, but it's safe to say that you recognize almost all of these and could probably identify them easily. So for example, you're going to see the little apple here, and you're going to know, oh, that's related to Macs and iPhones and these objects. And that is a subconscious association that your brain has made, right? And then you see those other ones like the little swoosh at the bottom, and you can associate that with not only the word Nike, but also with greater ideas or feelings of success, winning, champions, or maybe any of the athletes that have endorsed it on commercials. Now, no one ever sat you down and said, this is McDonald's and this is what they do. Make sure that you remember that, right? But instead, you were constantly faced with this repeated exposure, and with that eventually became these like really, really deep grooves in your brain that are connecting point A to point B and making it easier for you to make that association, so that whenever you see McDonald's, you think big juicy burger or really good French fries at 2 in the morning, right? Now, here's the hard part though. So my personal experience with McDonald's 6 months ago was that it's not enjoyable. And my values tell me that next time I want to go to McDonald's, I'm actually going to pick something else that's going to be a more enjoyable experience because I value food that tastes good and is a positive experience. But when I drive by a McDonald's later, the first thing that's coming to mind isn't my experience 6 months ago, but instead the commercial that I saw on TV last night, and the commercial I saw on TV the night before, and the one before. It's going to be the things that are the most accessible, not necessarily the most true. It's going to be the ones that you had the most exposure to, whether that's because you saw it on TV yesterday or because you've seen it so many times to date that it doesn't matter what your own personal experience was, for the way that your brain decides what is and isn't true. So now my brain is completely disregarding what I know to be true, and instead grabbing this accessible information, and I find myself turning into a McDonald's parking lot whether or not I want to. So note that in these situations, a lot of times the actual ties that your brain makes between point A and B, it doesn't matter what you truly believe or what you personally have experienced. A lot of what matters is just what you've received the most exposure to. And the problem with that is sometimes it's right and sometimes it's really, really wrong. And so we must start with the understanding that we all have biases that affect our perceptions. and oftentimes ones that are contrary to our value system. And so one of your first lines of defense is understanding that these biases show up and that there's a lot of ways that you can identify those automatic associations and actually address them. And the thing is that we don't only do this with brands, with Nike, with McDonald's, but we also do this with entire groups of people, and that's where implicit bias comes in. So the definition, I know you all probably had at least some experience with implicit bias. The definition that we use for this is the automatic or unconscious attitudes or beliefs about people based on stereotypes. And so we say this to say that, there's these attitudes, these big ideas, maybe they're complicated, but all about the same theme, or maybe it's just, a few key words, but they now get placed with an entire group of people. And the problem with that is that while stereotypes sometimes can be true, they hardly ever represent the full experience of any individual or any group of people. So an example I often use when it comes to implicit bias is the relationship between gender and careers. So now every single person here knows logically that women, men, anybody really can equally do any sort of profession regardless, right? We know that men can be pilots and women can be pilots, that men could be flight attendants and women can be flight attendants. But unfortunately, when we put you in certain situations, your brain is going to grab the thing that's most familiar, and you're going to think that men are doctors, women are nurses, men are lawyers, women are librarians. Part of the question to ask, perhaps you've had a female doctor, you're still thinking that. So the question is, where does this come from? And so if you do a quick Google search, here's what comes up when you search for nurse. These are the first pictures. Here's what comes up for business executive. I'm sure this looks probably like business executives that you're most familiar with. This is flight attendant. That is exactly what I think a flight attendant looks like. This is pilot. And with each of these, you see that, again, while you have these sort of individual stories and experiences and things that you know to be true, that women can be pilots, when you look at the top 10 or 15 pictures here, there's very few female pilots. And so if I say pilot, you're going to think of a male first. So when our mind makes conclusions about people based on things like race and gender and sexuality, we call these stereotypes. And stereotypes are shortcuts to understanding that don't take into account, again, the reality of a specific individual or any sort of complicated behavior experiences they have, but rather it is this really quick process that your brain does to associate these ideas and stories that you've grasped in the world and tie them back to what you now think is true in this moment. So you can likely think of some examples of these in your day-to-day, whether stereotypes about students from certain neighborhoods, maybe about Black students, about students in ESL courses, or maybe about students in accelerated learning routes. And with each of these, you can probably, jot down a few characteristics or expectations that you would have for each group of people. Now, while these are kind of, broad generalizations about entire groups of people, they do influence our judgments and behaviors when they're interacting with any sort of single individual. And while when I'm naming these, you're probably picturing specific students that you know, when you're still put in certain sorts of vulnerable situations, which we'll talk through in a second, you're still very likely to engage and rely more heavily on these biased stereotypes than you are on your actual personal experiences. So I want to take some time to walk through two really critical examples. Many people, and I should say that the reason that I want to do this is when I work with law enforcement and when I work with other community partners, one of the things we say about stereotypes is the best way to address them is to start by asking, where did this come from and why am I doing it? And so I want to walk through two examples to help unpack, where do these stereotypes come from, what's causing me to think this or believe it, and also what is the impact of that. So one of them is that many people are familiar with the stereotype that Asian American students are smarter than other students, that they're good at math, science, maybe better at computers than you are as a teacher. This stereotype doesn't sound bad, right? It sounds fairly benign. Nobody would really be upset if they were the student that was the smartest in the class and that was always their expectation. But the problem is that in order to understand how these stereotypes are incomplete, you have to really go back to the history of them. So let's talk about that. A stereotype begins with U.S. immigration policy, which has really given priority to those with access to education and wealth in an effort to select really elite immigrants. And of course, we know that this sort of immigration policy has been applied a lot more often to non-white communities, and that's why there's sort of this perception that the people who do come to the U.S. from non-white countries are the smartest and the best and the most wealthiest. Now, the selective immigration has contributed to a large population of Asian immigrants, particularly between 1990 and 1999, who are specifically really well educated and or really wealthy. So this has contributed just to the overall perception of what racial demographics are making up a school, and then within that, what educational demographics come up. Now, the problem, of course, is that East and South Asian immigrants have had a long and painful history of overt racial oppression and segregation in the U.S. But right around the Civil Rights Movement, right around 1966, the term model minority was introduced. And all of a sudden, it was intended to just forget this whole history of pain and racism, oppression, and instead try to juxtapose Asian Americans against African Americans. And sort of the language and the messaging was, see, other non-white racial groups are having no issue assimilating into white Anglo-American society and having no issue, getting an education and getting high-paying careers. So, what is the excuse for African Americans? And of course, this completely disregards histories of slavery, racism against Black and African Americans, and ultimately doesn't account for any sort of, terrible power and racial infrastructure that makes it impossible for equality to happen as is. So these two things, again, this is just sort of the history of where this comes from. And while it doesn't seem so bad now, what it really does is render invisible the personal academic challenges that certain groups of Asian Americans do face. It makes it harder for them to succeed in classes, right? So we see that Asian American students, specifically Filipino American and Vietnamese American students, actually we're finding are leaving school with still rudimentary English language learning and not succeed in classes at the same rate because they're facing these sort of racist stereotypes that they're already going to be good at this, so they need less attention in class. And so what we find is that Asian American students who still need support don't receive as much of it in school, end up being placed in wrong level classes, usually ones that are at a higher academic level than they're ready for. They don't receive individualized treatment or support for learning challenges. Okay, here's another one that we should touch base on. So a lot of people are also really familiar with the stereotype of Black and criminality, and this applies specifically to those who have any interactions with Black students, which would be most educators, right? So there's been a series of experiments that have looked at, what is the impact of the overall perception. And what we found, whether we're sitting down with teachers, police, juvenile probation officers, is that when we give them short stories to read, these little vignettes about maybe a student or a juvenile offender, whatever classification, and we ask them to give a suggested punishment for how they should respond in that situation. When we say that it's a white student, or when we say it's a Black student, or when we just subtly imply it, maybe by the name or the context or narrative, what we found is that Black students are receiving harsher punishments in these sort of automatic decision-making processes. And it's important to remember, this is just in vignettes, right? This is when teachers are really putting their value systems, walking through the process slowly and saying, we believe that this is a reasonable way to work with a student. And there's still this presence of implicit bias that shows up. And I mentioned, I work at the Center for Policing Equity, and one of our co-founders, Dr. Phil Goff, did a study a few years back that looked at how Black boys specifically were perceived, and found that just looking at their pictures or through interactions, those who were in charge of them, whether it was educators, adults, probation officers, we're seeing them as being more culpable than their white counterparts, as being more responsible for whatever it was, and also several years older, which means that adults would be looking at a picture of a Black male 10-year-old and seeing him as being a 13 or 14. And now if you are a teacher who is seeing your student as 14 when they're really 10, you're going to have different sort of expectations on their behavior, and they may end up with more harsh discipline or punishment because the expectations are incorrectly assigned to them. And so the way that this matters is Black youth end up being more likely than any other racial group to be detained, expedited for formal processing, referred to adult court, given out-of-home placement, being imprisoned, and viewed by law enforcement again as being culpable and more likely to reoffend and needing to, be more dealt with in the moment. So here you have two very familiar stereotypes, right? That Asian American students are smarter and that Black students are more likely to engage in criminal behavior. And while you may be able to picture your students' faces who may fall into either of these racial categories, and while you may be able to tell very individual stories about those students and how they defy those stereotypes, there are situations where these specific experiences are going to fall away, and instead the first things that your brain is going to jump to are going to be stereotypes, and they're going to be things that are more familiar or things that you have had more repeated exposure to. So let's talk about these. What are these? These are conditions that we have found have proven to cause implicit bias to manifest more frequently. And so as I go through this list, I'm just going to put them all on the board. As I go through this list, I'm sure you can all identify opportunities or moments in your own career, in your own educational day-to-day where these things happen, right? I'm sure at least one teacher in this webinar has felt tired or hungry, but had to teach class instead. I'm sure everybody here has had a chance when it was their first year of teaching, it was their first year of being an educator and in these environments. And that comes with a lot of stress, right? You start to feel a lot more vulnerable. And so your brain is basically going into overdrive and trying to say, no, we don't have to take in all the facts. Let's just follow our regular patterns to make your job easier. Feeling stressed is a big one. Being in a bad mood or angry is a big one. One that I think really matters. And this isn't something you won't be able to control for, but you're constantly multitasking and constantly distracted as an educator, right? Because you are trying to get a lesson across. You are managing 30 plus kids in a single classroom, to get everybody to stay in their seats and also to be actually absorbing the things that are coming out of your mouth. And when you're holding the weight of 30 plus students, plus your own experience and your own career and anything that comes with that, it puts you in a situation where your brain is trying to say, no, settle down, I got this. Let's just, lean on some of our patterns and associations to make this process easier. Now, the other one I want to zero in on again is both this partnership of ambiguity and discretion. So when you as a teacher have to sort of interpret a policy to decide, when is it too far? When have they been speaking up for too long? And when you have that power and you haven't been able to define, explicit, this checks the box and that's when they're out of the classroom, that makes you more vulnerable to implicit bias and possibly misinterpreting a situation. One second, it's loading. So the other one I want to talk about, it's kind of a condition and mostly just, a very specific experience that you all go through as well. This is the concept of authority threat. This is the interpretation that you as an educator, your authority at the front of the classroom is being challenged in some way. And rather than recognizing that there's just a 14-year-old pushing back on authority or a 16-year-old trying to figure out, how this all works and testing boundaries, you take it as a personal assault on your own identity. And there's situations that trigger this more likely. So if being an authority figure is important to you, two, if you have the ability to manage people's perceptions, and if that's being threatened, and then also if there are significant consequences if you can't do that. Obviously, as a teacher, if you aren't able to manage your classroom, there comes a big threat with that. And when that happens, and you're experiencing authority threat, there's actually a higher risk of responding with anger and escalatory behavior. And even, interestingly enough, depending on which group of people, specifically when it's Black students or when it's non-white students, that authority threat feels even greater because of the sort of stereotypes that kick in. So you may be more likely to experience this threat when you have this unconscious stereotype, whether it's that the student in front of you is criminal, aggressive, violent, disruptive. And this in turn puts negatively stereotyped people in general at a higher risk of being involved in escalated interactions. And so now you're holding in this conversation, and I recognize it's a lot, you're having to hold the stereotypes of anybody you're interacting with, and also your own bias and the possibility that you're feeling threatened in your own role. And that's a lot to hold on to, right? But it's important to really think about and continue to consider how these things interact and intersect with each other, because it's important to consider, that this is work worth doing. I just want to really reiterate that while it seems hard to hold on to implicit bias and authority threat and really wrap our minds around all of these processes, when there are the lives of students on the line here, it's really important that we do this work and try to engage with these really complicated strategies to actually make changes and reduce the likelihood that bias is going to happen in our day-to-day. And so I know that that's a lot, but I don't want to leave here today without spending some time talking through some strategies. So let's do that. But let me pause for a second and just do a quick review so that we're all kind of caught up on the same page. So again, racial disparities are alive and well in discipline outcomes, especially for Black students and also for any other group of non-white students. Your brain is going to be quick to sort of make associations and take shortcuts to make your day-to-day easier. But the problem with these associations is some of these are based off of negative stereotypes and histories longer than your educational career. They're not just based off of personal experiences, but of racism from the last 200 plus years. And this matters because you're making associations ultimately about groups of people and how you interact with them in a way that we call stereotypes. Now, certain situations are going to make this more likely. So when you're feeling vulnerable through some of those conditions that we talked about earlier, that you're hungry, that you're tired, that you're stressed, that you're new, that policies feel ambiguous or things feel unclear. And we know that ultimately this impacts the way that you discipline a student and how you perceive the situation and what discipline route is ultimately determined. So knowing the role of implicit bias, as I said, is the first step to addressing it, and it's entirely worth it because of the long-standing impact that this can have on students. And so now let's talk about the actual strategies. There's 3 areas, and I tried to make this easy for you. I've just got 3 PowerPoint slides, so if you're taking notes, you could take out your phone and take a picture of it, or just do a screenshot of those 3 slides. And then I would recommend going back and looking through them and taking some time to figure out how they fit into the work that you all are doing. So the first one is going to be proactive awareness. Let me just put these all up so you can take notes if you need to. So this first idea is that I want to reiterate is self-reflection. And so it becomes really important that, that you're here in this webinar and that you continue to engage in this work by simply being aware that implicit bias is relevant and that authority threat can really contribute to disparities. And asking yourself questions about this and checking in on, where bias might show up is really, really important. One of the things that I have a coworker who used to do this, she would say something and realize it might have been a stereotype or might have sounded biased, and then she would pause and ask herself, where did that come from? Where am I pulling the stereotype from? Because maybe it's true, but also there must be something that informed that experience. And when you take time to do that, you help to sort of differentiate between these really big stereotypes and people's personal experiences that are definitely going to be more complicated. It's also, I mentioned this earlier, we've been doing research to figure out what happens with these trainings, that if we connect with law enforcement and we teach them about implicit bias, we're finding that simply by engaging in that, there are substantial reductions in disparity, whether that's in use of force or vehicle or pedestrian stuff. And that matters for law enforcement, and that same sort of engagement behavior matters for you as an educator. So we do know that simply by doing the work, which is what you're doing now, and engaging in these principles, you're creating opportunities to reflect back and really slow down the process of implicit bias happening in any sort of disciplinary action. The second one is going to be awareness of vulnerable conditions. So let me look at these again for you. Here they are. So the first thing is, the first thing is identifying these vulnerable conditions and doing something about it when you have the power to. So some of these I know you're not going to be able to change. This might just be your first year, and you're just going to have to sit and reconcile with the fact that you're going to have to be extra careful in some of these disciplinary actions because you might be more vulnerable to this. Or you know that you have a class right before lunch and you're hungry and they're hungry and everyone's distracted. So maybe just put more snacks in your desk so that you know that you are well equipped and in the right space to be educating that day and to be responsive to your students and aware of, all the different things at play. Let me back up again. And then, like I said, there's times when you won't be able to change stuff, but you can still change your awareness of it. And that becomes really critical too. So sometimes there are things you can do to control the situation, but sometimes your best line of defense is just going to be that you are aware and that you are conscious, and that if you can't control that, you can still take initiative by trying to slow down the interaction, take initiative by trying to be mindful of stereotypes that could be at play in the situation, and not in that moment, but separately in your own time, be willing to name what those stereotypes are and really unpack that and challenge that. One of the things that we encourage people to do is replace the actual stereotypes that are there. So you can do this by trying to seek out cross-group relationships. So maybe that means trying to be in a more diverse group, or maybe that means diversifying who's in your general network, joining a new book club, going to a different sort of church, trying to make sure that you're getting face time with diverse groups of people so that your only interactions with students that you may have to discipline isn't tied to a negative stereotype. Another one, again, is to actively challenge those stereotypes, because that's really, really critical. And then seek out counter stereotypical media representations. So 2 ways to do this that are, I think, pretty helpful. One of them is reading. Read about stories that are very different than your own. And for the sake of your students, read about stories that you think might be relevant to your students, or ask them for recommendations on things that they should learn, or that you should be learning or mindful of or understand. And it's easy. You just have to do a quick Google search to find books. I actually did this last night, and I found this this website that's new to me. It's socialjusticebooks.com, and it's got just a great list of books at every different age level, including for adults, about different sort of racial groups, religious groups, and different sort of experiences that your students might be going through. And it's helpful to just expand your understanding and be mindful and curious about what goes beyond the stereotype and what are some of the other stories that my students might be experiencing on a day-to-day. Another important way to do this, because you are visual, and so there's a reason that racial stereotypes seem to have such long-standing impact, is because of perception and what you actually physically see. So one thing that is really important too is making sure that you have counter-stereotypical movies and films, music videos, images in front of your face, right? Just like the Google images about gender and career, to be able to identify some, areas where you're seeing just one sort of face and really mix it up is important. One thing that, one exercise that we do when we do trainings is make a list of 10 movies, whatever first 10 movies come to mind, and then go back through and see if you can find a queer character, an Asian character with a non-speaking role, a female character who has more than just a love interest, but also real speaking parts, a Black female lead. And having some of these, doing that sort of like checklist is helpful to remember that, yeah, there are really diverse representations of media out there, but it's very easy for whatever is right in front of your face to not be so diverse. And so it's important for you as an individual to take initiative and find stereotypes that will actually replace the ones that are currently there. Let's skip over these. Okay, this next one is talking about, so this is concept number 2, and this is procedural justice. This is when we roll out these trainings to law enforcement, there's actually 2 courses they do before this that focus specifically on this concepts of procedural justice. And this is because research has found that when people interact with law enforcement, if they don't like the outcome, but they did appreciate the process, it ends up being an okay experience for them. And so that means that if you get pulled over for something that you did wrong and you get a ticket, if the officer was procedurally just and explained to you why you got a ticket, why we have to follow these rules, and was kind and polite and respectful, yeah, you just got a $200 ticket, but you felt respected and taken care of, and so you leave that interaction fairly positive. In contrast, if you get pulled over and the officer does not engage in procedural justice and you leave and then lets you go off and you don't get a ticket, the fact that you had a really negative experience and interaction with that officer has a lot more long-standing impacts. And as we talk with law enforcement about, it actually really breaks down that trusting relationship that is really, really critical for this whole symbiotic process, you know, for communities in general. And so we encourage people to employ these 4 tenets. And so there's 2 ways I want you to think about this. The first is internally for you as an educator. So in any interaction that you have, be sure to give students a voice and a chance to tell their story, because while you might have perceived it a certain way, if you don't get the full information from the student, you may have missed a few pieces. And it's possible that your perception is clouded or impacted by implicit bias or stereotypes that you may have about that individual or a group that they are part of. Number 2 is neutrality. So ensure that you're being objective and really considering both sides. So whether that's an interaction with multiple students or just one interaction with a single student, being sure that you are not taking sides too soon, not assuming that they did something wrong before it's really been ensured. And number 3 is respect. So continuing to use language and communication that is good and shows that you respect and value this person, and that while they are young and adolescent and growing, you still see them as an individual and as a human that deserves to be heard and be treated in a good way. We always tell people to engage in the golden rule, but we actually want to push that a step further and say engage the platinum rule. So not only do unto others as you would do to yourself, but do unto others as they would want to be treated, right? And the only way to do this is by asking, by trying to check in and see what are the needs of that individual student or the students in your classroom. So one way you can do this is at the beginning of a school year or even at the beginning of a classroom, at the beginning of a class, trying to get this information from students of, hey, what are your expectations for me as an educator? What are your expectations of how this plays out? And really trying to value and hear what they're saying behind, you know, what they've actually said. And then the 4th one is engaging in trustworthiness and transparency. So if you do have to discipline a student and they do have to go to the office or they do end up with a suspension, it's really critical for you as the person making that referral to explain your decision and then consistently enforce that rule and policy for any student in that same process, because that really takes out that differential selection and differential processing that we talked about earlier. The other thing we talk about is the procedural justice of an organization in general. And so as an entire school or as an entire school district, it's really important that these rules and values are internalized into the entire organizational infrastructure. And so that means making sure that, you know, rules are explicitly defined and that there are really clear norms for policies and behaviors and that these are always enacted for all students. It also means, you know, for educators who do have more power and are in charge, to be listening to other teachers as they say that they're struggling with certain types of policies or certain ambiguity, and then trying to reduce that ambiguity in policies so that we're running into less of that as an issue. Another one is checks and balances accountability. So making sure that the student, if a student is sent to the principal's office, that there is still, you know, follow-up so that it's not an automatic suspension, but so that the teacher has an opportunity to explain and understand and determine how discipline should go out in this situation, and then the principal also has an opportunity to do that. This makes sure that, you know, if somebody missed the mark, if bias or stereotypes were relevant, that there's still time to address it and maybe account for that before any sort of referral that could have a more long-standing impact. And then the other big one that we always advocate to is to collect and analyze comprehensive data on discipline. So again, I'm not entirely sure all of who's on here, but for those of you that maybe have more power, if you're a principal or a vice principal, it's really important that you pay attention to what your disciplinary data is saying and notice when there may be areas of inequity and try to do things to address that. So it's really important when we have numbers like that aren't just in file folders in the back of a closet somewhere, but are actually considered and evaluated and taken into the situation. It becomes really helpful for trying to figure out, where are we possibly contributing to the school to present pipeline, and what can we do as an entire school to make a difference in that, and what can we do as just the administration or just as educators to make changes in that. And the final set of things to consider is engage in de-escalation tactics whenever and as often as possible. So at no point should you forget that you are working with adolescents whose brains are still in development and whose behaviors are not finessed in a way that can be treated as adults, right? So this means consistently engaging in patient communication. You may have to say something 6 or 7 times before a student really hears it and understands what you're saying. Be mindful of all the different components you're managing. So you are holding on to the difficult or escalating behavior that is happening in front of you with a student, but you are also managing your own perspective, your own emotions, your own feelings of being threatened or being in a vulnerable situation, your own biases, your stereotypes about the other student. And so control for the things that you can, right? Slow down when you can, take time to do that as much as possible. And then just continue to remind yourself, who you're working with and what are these more complicated stories that we have about the students that we're interacting with, right? That go far beyond the stereotype that we might be leaning on in the moment. And then the final one, again, is make sure you're checking in with yourself through that whole process, because it could be pretty easy to, think that you're doing fine, but then if you paused and reflected, realize that, yeah, you did feel a little bit threatened. Yeah, you did feel like you didn't have a whole handle on the situation, and that's part of why you sent the student to the office. So those are the tips and strategies that I have for you today. It sounds like we now have an opportunity to open the floor for questions. So I'm going to hand this back over to Dawana in case there are any.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristen, for all that wonderful information and very practical tools that folks can use following tonight's webinar. So this is the time for questions. We already have a couple. And so if you have a question, you can enter the question in the question box. Or if you are, again, if you're calling on your phone, there's no way that I have to call on you, so you can email me a question and I can ask that for you on the phone. And so our first question, can you suggest measures for educators to assess their implicit bias?
Yes, thank you so much. So there's a few things. I know I spoke to this a little bit when we talked about the procedural justice, but one of the things is to really pay attention to the data that you have. So you want to try to figure out, are there disparities, and are we specifically seeing those disparities on behavior that is the same? So if we have 10 eighth graders and they all get in trouble for the same behavior, are we seeing that the Black eighth graders get a suspension or expulsion, but the white eighth graders did not? And if so, what's happening there? And so really trying to unpack those things. Another one that I think is really, really important is to pay attention to both students and their parents when they speak about things like this, because that's felt really deeply for a reason. And sometimes it might not come off in direct numbers, right? So for example, we were talking about the Asian American students. They might be not receiving the same sort of support in school, and maybe that will show up on a GPA and maybe it won't. But if at parent-teacher conferences you're hearing the same parents say that they're struggling with this issue, you have to take that into consideration and really pause and reflect and figure out, why is that happening, and what can we now do to address that and be responsive for that. So that's one way to identify if there are areas of implicit bias, right? To listen to people who might be saying it, to use real data to find that. Another one that we really encourage is take time to actually evaluate the policies that you have. When we've done this with some of our schools, we've pulled all of their policies and we've realized there are things in there from legitimately 100 years ago that are harder to interpret, that don't make a lot of sense, and that we're not written, that even the educators aren't sure how to employ them in the moment, and it takes a lot of time to figure out what a policy is saying. So it's important to make sure that the policies reflect behavior of students on a day-to-day basis, are also modern and reflect the way that we understand and think about things. And it's important that you maybe one way to do that is that principals sit down with a group of educators and they ask them to tell them, what are some policies that you're confused about, or take these 5 policies, how would you interpret them, to see if there are differences in the way that they're seeing that, because that creates a lot of room for bias to happen, and that's something that you obviously want to address.
Thank you, Kristen. Can you talk more about the impact of discretion in disciplinary conferences?
Can you repeat that one more time?
Sure. Can you talk more about the impact of discretion in disciplinary conferences?
Yeah, so discretion is really important because it has a lot to do about how you interpret the situation. So when you are coming into these situations where you're having to manage probably, like a lot of emotions, a lot of feelings and concern, and really trying to convene and figure out, what is the best route for discipline in whatever this particular experience is. It becomes really easy for you to rely on stereotypes. It becomes really easy for you to be vulnerable to those conditions that we talked about earlier, because these feel like high stakes moments and can really have an impact. So again, I would say that it's really important to be mindful and make sure that you have the full story of not just what you think happened, but really engage in procedural justice as much as possible. I think this is those tactics we shared on procedural justice are really, really relevant when it comes to handling discretion, so that when it is up to you as the individual to make decisions and decide how this plays out, you're taking steps to slow down the process and engage in really procedurally ordered and really just behavior that takes into account the individual experiences of a student and of whatever's voiced by authority or parents or anybody else in the room, and that you're consistently engaging respect throughout that entire process, and making sure that whatever ultimate disciplinary action results, that it's clear and transparent why that decision was made, and that even for that student, that it feels like that is a fair decision, and one that is consistently upheld no matter which student happens to be sitting in the chair at that time.
Great, thank you. Do you have any recommendations or resources that you can recommend for de-escalation in the face of trauma or mental illness?
Cool. That's a really awesome question. I know that, so our juvenile justice team has created put together some resources around that, and I don't have any specifically off of the top of my head, but I'm happy to do some research and try to figure out what those would be, because yes, I think that is something that we didn't cover too much, and consistently needs more attention, is that even in all of these situations, not only are we accounting for adolescent behavior, but a lot of times you're dealing with students who have been through a ton of trauma that is not obvious necessarily. And so the sort of behaviors and actions and responses can be even more unpredictable than they already would be. And it's important that you meet them where they are and don't engage in additional disciplinary actions that could actually hurt them more in the long run, both for trauma and for mental illness too, and mental health. When there's things that are not obvious and that students don't wear publicly on their faces or and only through their actions that it comes up, yeah, it becomes really easy to miss the mark and maybe engage in bias and in the wrong response. So like I said, I don't have specific recommendations for resources around either trauma or mental health off the top of my head, but I know our juvenile justice team has put together a bunch of resources. So at the end of this, I'll leave my email on the screen. If you want to email me directly, I can look into it. Or if you want to email Dawana, and I'll still look into it, and she can follow up with you and make sure that you get some more resources on that area.
Okay, thank you. And yes, if there are resources that Kristen mentions that we haven't shared, then we can share those in the Google Drive when we share the recording of the webinar in a couple of days. How do you address outward displays of emotions from students?
Let me think about this. So I would encourage you to go back to these strategies that we just talked about, right? And this first one, thinking again about how do we engage, just become really proactively aware of what's going on. So understand how their emotions might be impacting you personally, and then also be mindful of what else might be feeding that. As much as possible, engage in de-escalating tactics, like we talked about earlier. Try to slow things down as quickly as well. Try to slow things down as much as possible, and sometimes it's just going to require repetition. So even as a student's behavior is escalating, to be able to keep your voice calm and continue to reiterate the same things. Eventually you can be heard, but I know that you're often up against you only have a minute or two to really deal with that situation. So engage in procedural justice as quickly and as efficiently as possible. Try to hear what they're saying and repeat it back to them, right? Use really validating language, hey, I hear you saying this, and I hear that you're upset, and I want to acknowledge that, or I understand why you would be upset with what's going on right now. We hear that, and I respect that. Let's talk this through, and let's try to be calm about it, right? So trying to just do really active listening tactics, I guess, is really helpful to, again, give them a voice and then continue to manage it. I don't care if a student's emotions are all over the board. You as the educator, your emotions don't have to be, and you get to be in control of that as much as possible. And so remembering sort of these wider structures that are happening, and try to identify these tactics of, all right, let's try procedural justice tactic 1. Okay, that didn't work. Let's try procedural justice tactic number 2, and kind of see it as these bullet points to attempt and try to engage and lean into can be really helpful, so that you're kind of taking yourself out of the situation a little bit, and really trying to reduce the possibility of getting sucked into it or feeling like your authority is threatened. And it helps you to feel like you have more control in the room too.
Thank you. So, Kristen, so you mentioned earlier about, also speaking to families as well as students. What suggestions do you have in engaging with families to ensure that bias doesn't get in the way of your engagement with them? We also know that sometimes if you have certain attitudes or stereotypes towards young people, that often extends to their families as well. So are there any strategies that you have to engage families in a way where we're not letting bias cloud either our thoughts or our actions?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really awesome question. Yeah, because as much as you're dealing with a student in that moment, you're also having to hold, the weight of the family and all of those experiences. Like we said before, your brain, it makes these associations and jumps to these conclusions oftentimes faster than you have a chance to process and take in information, and it's going to go off of things that are most familiar. So if you have a chance and you're about to engage with a parent or interact with some parents, and that it's about a specific issue, I would try to do research, and there's a few ways you could do it, right? You could actively be replacing those stereotypes, honestly, right before, so that you have more of a complex story and your mind is just considering that as you go. You can also, when you're starting to interact with a parent, try to get to know them a little bit, get them to say some things that kind of tie it back to their personal experiences, so that they're not just a parent and a child, but they are Derek's parent, right? And you know Derek, and he is a really awesome student, and he cares about X, Y, and Z, and he is really creative. And because you know that, and you know that he actually, because of something that his mom just said, oh, your mom is also creative, and oh, you guys care about some of these things. And now all of a sudden, as we're leaning into this interaction, it's a lot more personal, because you're seeing sort of a more complicated story, and there's more values again. So I would say, if you're going to engage with anybody's family, and there is this concern about the same sort of bias, and you don't know the family, but you do know the student, and you know that a lot of those characteristics and things that you see and value about that student, they're also going to be coming from that parent too. And so trying to hear and identify some of those just in the first minute or two, those first impressions, and holding on to that can be really helpful. And again, I think engaging in voice, I think it's always really important to acknowledge and respect a parent who is showing up to engage on behalf of their student, whether or not they're right, whether or not the student is right, but trying to acknowledge that and validate that, to say, hey, Mr. Turner, I think it's really awesome that you are here, and I do think it's important that parents are engaging, and I value that, because even when the parent immediately starts to feel heard, their guard's going to come down a little bit more, and there's going to be an opportunity to really engage in interaction in a more positive and productive way.
Perfect. I think our next couple of questions are about kind of larger scale, issues. So the next one is, what is the best or most efficient way to supply this type of teaching into a community of educators to get everyone on the same page and using the same discipline matrix?
Let me think. So, really good question. I think this is something we think about a lot. When I roll out these trainings with law enforcement, with community, we actually put a cap on our classes, and the classes can go anywhere from 4 hours to 8 hours. We only ever really let in about 30 participants at a time, and that's because a lot of doing this work requires undoing beliefs and conscious and subconscious understandings that you have, and trying to reconcile things that might be hurtful and harmful, and also, it's a really vulnerable process. And so what we've found is those are really, really productive when they're in smaller groups, when you have a chance to kind of sit at tables of 4 and then, go back and forth between working in small groups and then sharing with the class at large. And one of the issues that we're running into now is, how do we actually scale this up so that you can teach this, right? Because even as a webinar, I feel so restricted. There's so many things that I think are even more teachable when we're face-to-face time, when we can sort of workshop stuff and talk through examples and do more demonstrations, that unfortunately, you can't get across the same way just through discussing the ideas in a webinar. Because I think in order to address implicit bias, it requires really, really engaging. So one of the things I encourage is to seek out opportunities for implicit bias trainings. I know CB is trying to consider, how we can make ours, scale it out and make it larger. It's not yet available, but there are other sort of implicit bias trainings, and any sort of small interactions or tools like that can be really useful. I gave you these strategies, and it sounds like this webinar will be available. So share it with other people, and then maybe consider doing mini workshops as like an educational enrichment activity or something, where teachers can talk through some of these strategies and talk about how they might show up or really actively reconcile with those stereotypes together. And then in terms of, I think, of trying to use the same discipline matrix, again, make policies as clear as possible so that any teacher on any floor working with any of the grades can have a real clear understanding of what it means to disrupt the educational environment, what it means to engage in battery versus engaging in pushing and shoving, and make sure that there's a very clear black and white line as much as possible. Because whenever you can reduce that ambiguity and take some of that discretionary power off of the educator, and put it back, where it belongs in the rules, you're actually going to be more productive and effective in creating equitable outcomes.
Okay, and you touched on this a little bit, I think, in your last answer. So when we're thinking about the school district, if the school district wants to do deeper work with implicit bias with their staff, what suggestions do you have for that? I know earlier you talked about how important, kind of policy change was, but do you have any advice for, school districts that are doing that? And then also even in the policy change, how do you write and craft policies where we are less likely to be able to even act on our bias in the school building?
Okay, so the first question is to how can, I guess, what leaders
how can, if the district wants to do deeper work with implicit bias with their staff, what suggestions do you have?
Okay. And then the second question is, how do you make the policies clear?
Yep.
Okay, so in regards to the first one, I think it's really, really awesome if you can find a district that believes that they need to do really deep work on this and does choose to make it a priority. So with law enforcement, one of the things that we do to help understand just how far this bias goes and sort of the magnanimity of it is we encourage law enforcement to do listening sessions. I feel like, sometimes in schools there's opportunities for that with school board meetings, or, just creating sort of town hall-esque events where parents can sort of voice any concerns, and similarly where students could also do the same. And then whatever is being shared, to really take that to heart when it comes to bias and really try to look into, what are the specific experiences that our students are facing? Because what you're going to find is that this really, really varies across the board. Like I'm sure that there are some schools that are predominantly white, and they're still going to have areas of bias that they have to focus on, right? Maybe that means working with not students of color, but queer students or LGBTQIA+ students, or gender nonconforming students that are experiencing a lot of bias too. And so it becomes important to, I think, one, do research to really understand who are your students and where are we seeing disparities and where's this bias showing up. And then again, there's using some of these processes that we discussed in the webinar of understanding where what stereotypes exist and might exist specifically about groups of students that you interact with, and then understanding sort of the science behind it. So use this information and share it more broadly, because I think it's really important. And one of the first steps is trying to understand that, this is really normal what your brain is doing. This isn't necessarily about engaging in explicit racism here. And it doesn't mean because I engaged in implicit bias that I'm a terrible person, but rather that my actions are also the result of hundreds of years of work, hundreds of years of impact around racism and sexism and whatnot. And so while that doesn't make me exempt, it does help me to understand that some of this work is subconscious and you have to do really active undoing of it and active unlearning in order to relearn things too. So again, identify those stereotypes and then do the counter of that, of replacing those stereotypes. Again, trying to be really proactively aware, not only as individual educators, but also as a school district. What are parents saying? What are we noticing are trends? What are we mindful of? And then again, taking time to really review and look at their policies. And then, so some of the ways that you can make the policies clear is to have really explicit, be as explicit as possible in terms of, this is battery when somebody shoves somebody with one hand, and with somebody shoves somebody with two hands. If somebody gets punched in the face, we call that battery. Trying to be not only as clear as possible on as many scenarios or outcomes that could happen in a situation, but also providing a lot of examples right below any policy that you name. So that way, it's not just some random policy, but you can kind of see how it would be put into practice. So, for example, if it was disrupting the educational environment, have 4 or 5 examples under that policy of this is when you might consider this disruptive to the class environment. It's when other students get involved. It's when the interaction has gone on for more than 4 minutes and the student is still upset and we can't seem to move forward with the classroom, right? To be able to have some clear examples in any of those policies is really helpful. And then again, you would be surprised if you really took time to look at the policies, how ambiguous some of the language is. Like, get rid of words that just say, of things that are just really vague or general. Anything that just says like really long or really tall, or sometimes there is just real language like that in there. So making sure that that doesn't happen. And then if you're seeing the same sort of, again, take a look at your records, even in the last year, of where discipline was happening the most, and also where you think there might be disparity, and look at those policies, because those are going to be the most common, and see if there may have been a misinterpretation at some point by somebody, or if teachers have a different understanding across the board of what that means to be late to class or to disrupt a class.
Okay, our next couple questions kind of center around, well, the first one is, how do you address bias when it may occur amongst colleagues?
Ooh.
So not necessarily how we address the student, but when I'm, interacting with my colleagues.
That is an awesome question. Yeah. So again, I think one of the first things to always reiterate is when you want to address bias, you're not going in there to tell somebody that they have bad principles or bad values, or that they're, racist, sexist, whatever, right? You're going in to address this because you are noticing that there's this pattern in a behavior, and it's not a reflection necessarily of their character, but rather of, these structures, these things that are way bigger than them as an individual, and that's why you want to bring it up. So that's number one. Make it clear that you're not there to talk about values or personal character, but you're there to talk about a behavior that feels more tangible and is something that you're concerned about. Number two, I think it's important to pull in as many of your own personal examples as possible. So if I want to teach somebody about bias, I have to be vulnerable and humble and talk about other times when I myself am engaging in bias, because that creates more of an opportunity for conversation and really engaging in dialogue, rather than the sort of, I'm really good at this and you're really bad at this, so let me show you the way. Because we all know that's not true, right? Even the best educator who is doing this work can still fall into bias at different times. And maybe it's not an actual behavior that they've engaged in, but maybe it's a thought that's come up, or a stereotype that they've noticed that they're starting to engage in and then had to interrupt, right? So when you can, I would try to share your own personal experiences to start it out, and be vulnerable about how this is something that you care about and also that you've had to do work around. And then I would start to talk about, I'm noticing that there is this sort of pattern of behavior, and what I'm learning is that it's, this is more of a cognitive process, until you can talk about some of the things that you've learned about, these associations or this reliance on stereotypes. And so then when you notice it, you're talking about it and really trying to pull in more truth and more facts than just, hey, I saw this and this is why you're wrong. Instead saying, hey, this is something that we all have work to do and all have undoing and unlearning to do. And I want to do this collaboratively in partnership with you. And then also, find creative ways to bring it up. So I don't know, share books that you think would be helpful for giving them more perspective, or share stories that you think are useful for them to be thinking about, right? If you're noticing that they keep sending Black students to the principal's office for the same behavior as white students, maybe start talking more consistently with them about your Black students that are succeeding, so that they're being more mindful of these other behaviors, or talk about more experiences that those particular Black students might be facing outside of school, to help this other teacher have a better grasp about just how complicated the student's life will be, and help them to see that individual is more than just a stereotype as well. So yeah, I would say this is a place where there is always so much work to do, because I mean, from a policy side, what we always tell cops is that, policy, like culture eats policy every day. So what you do as an educator in this environment is actually way more important, because more important than any policy or any sort of written document, because you have a lot of authority and influence when you lead in a way that is kind and considerate and respectful and mindful that, of all the different places that we're coming from. And it's important, I think, when you're doing this, to try to engage empathetically and remember when you didn't understand what restorative justice was, and when you didn't understand what implicit bias was, or how you could possibly be engaging in it. And think about what it would have taken for you to learn that, or what it took for you to understand that and really come around to engage more thoroughly with it. And then see how you can sort of meet whatever other teacher it is that is engaging in this bias, meet them where they're at, and try to employ these same tactics that helped you to learn and understand. But this is always going to be about conversation and dialogue, and kindful accountability, right? Not just telling people that they're wrong and trying to fix it overnight, but understanding that this is a hard reconciliatory process, and really invite them to do that work that you all need to be doing collaboratively as educators together in partnership.
Perfect. I think I'm going to ask one last question. I'm going to combine a couple questions that we still have out there. So what strategies can you offer for educators to help students understand bias and recognize when it occurs, especially since, as adults, we're models for our young people. And so if you have either adults interacting in a way where there is, clear bias, or adults enacting or making decisions within the school that is led by bias, and young people are picking up on that, how do we get young people to kind of recognize, that it's happening? And so either they don't do it themselves, or they can advocate for themselves when they see it happening.
Yeah, that's awesome. Add to that even more. Sometimes I think it's easy to underestimate just how much students are picking up about this stuff. But they understand a lot and they feel it. And so you have such an amazing opportunity that shouldn't be taken for granted, that you get to talk to them about some of these things, because they might notice this pattern that they are the ones that are constantly getting sent to the office for disruptive behavior, but they may not have words or a name for it. And so when you're able to say, hey, this is the school to prison pipeline, hey, this is what's going on, or this is what you should understand about stereotypes and how they might be impacting you as an individual, that really empowers a student, and it gives them words to an experience that they have but don't know how to speak to. And it goes really far, because again, these are patterns that they're picking up on too, and that they're feeling deeply and don't necessarily have the words for. I would say, because they may feel this from educators, they may feel this in other areas of their community, and they may feel this from other students. So explaining to them how stereotypes work and why it matters, explaining to them, what are the history of some of these stereotypes. Asian American immigrants or Asian American students, I think a few times we've shared this with Asian Americans, in some of our community classes, they've been surprised by some of this, and it's meant a lot to have these really specific examples. So trying to seek out the specific histories and narratives about where some of these stereotypes come from, and then also how they've had long-term impacts, is really critical. I think, if you're on this webinar and you care about this, and you're wanting to share with other students, you just became one of their biggest advocates for this too. So continuing to reiterate that you are a safe space to bring up any concerns like this, and that you as an educator have power to address this in a way that maybe a student doesn't. And so help them understand that, while it's important to stand up for yourself and advocate, there will be times when it may not make sense for them to do that in the moment, but they have advocates like you on their behalf who they can go back to and ask for additional support, so that they don't get lost in the system, and they're also not just the ones pushing back, because it'll be really easy for somebody engaging in a disciplinary practice to say that that student is just being disrespectful and defying authority, rather than stop and reflect on, oh, maybe I am being biased here. And so Again, I talk to them about stereotypes, make it clear how they happen, and maybe talk to them about some ways that they might notice it about and why it matters, what sort of impacts it has. Put voice and language to the things that they're already experiencing. It's incredibly validating for them. And continue to advocate that you are a safe space and can step in for them and on their behalf, and take that as far as you can go, because you want to make sure that they understand that maybe sometimes they as a student aren't the best ones to advocate or push back because it could come off wrong. And so instead to rely on some of the authority figures and members in their life that they trust to do that work on their behalf as well.
Okay, perfect. So that was the end of our questions, and we're pretty much a little bit over time. I just need to take us out with a quote from Maya Angelou. Do the best you can. So you know better. And when you know better, do better. And Kristen has been nice enough to include her email address in case there are other questions out there. If you want to learn more about the work that she does, if there are resources that you need, feel free to email her or me, and we can get you the answers for that. We will be sending out a recording of tonight's webinar, and we'll be posting it on our website, rjpartnership.org, where you also have access to our previous webinars. And our next webinar will be April 30th at 6, and where we will be talking about youth-led restorative justice, and we'll even be joined by young people from different public schools who are doing this work. So thank you again for great information.
Thank you. And thank you again, everybody, for joining and for just all the amazing questions that you asked and for continuing to engage this work. I'd like to want to say I did include my email because I love this and I care about this, and I want to make sure that you all feel like you have resources. If you have questions about the work that we're doing at the Center for Policing Equity, feel free to check out our website or email me. And again, we're always here to be a resource and answer more questions for you. So thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.